I received a phone call this week from one of our listeners in Chicago. Tom introduced himself to me by saying that he was a progressive before they were called progressives. And he sent me a copy of a book that he had written 40 years ago to prove his point. And in fact, 30 years ago, we progressive religious types were typically called liberals. And maybe a generation before that, we were referenced as academics. I have no doubt that in a few years we'll be called something else entirely. I may more generally prefer the way the Buddha is at least said to have described himself. He said that he was not a god or a demigod. He was not even a prophet. He said simply, "I am awake." Tom was understandably proud of having seen through the fog of religious supernatural teachings without the benefit of having gone to college or having had a mentor to help him. That's not a small thing to be able to say about yourself, but I've almost made it a hobby to find examples of this kind of awakening that are evidenced in literature and among the people that I meet, translators of mine that I met in Nicaragua, neither of whom had even gone to high school, had managed to process the teachings of the Catholic Church in which they had been reared to realize as my friend, I can tell you, I met Jesus. He's about 4.5 feet tall and brown and gay. But Jesus told me, he says, Roger, I think Jesus said a lot of good things in the Bible, but all that heaven and hell stuff, I think they just made that up. And I said, Jesus, you're onto something there. I think you need to follow that up. But even here last week, we read a passage that's 2,000 years old from Marcus Aurelius that revealed a very mature progressive insight. And we often use quotes here in place of scripture readings. We will use quotes from Mark Twain, Thomas Paine, Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, that reveal that an awful lot of people who did not spend years going to seminary or laboring away in graduate schools of religion, that they have been able, through their own intellect, their reason, their rational, critical thinking, to wake up from the illusions and the magical thinking of religion that have left so much of history in the fog. Now, for our Independence weekend, I had selected this passage from Walt Whitman's most famous book of poems, Leaves of Grass. Whitman published this the first time when the United States was not quite 75 years old. And in those days, print runs were fairly short, so you had a chance to do a second edition, a third edition. So he kept rewriting this book of poetry right up to the time of the Civil War. But he reflected on the deep imagination and the progressive view of both religious and political liberty that was part of the American experiment, a deep respect for the rights and the value of every person. I took this passage that looked to me almost like Whitman giving us a creedal statement for the United States, telling us to love the earth and the animals, to despise riches. I mean, really, a great deal of what brought colonists to America was to escape the class-tiered society of Europe. But as soon as white folk got here, they started to reinstitute the tiered society. So they hated the economic tyrants of Europe, but they came here hoping they could become economic tyrants. So Whitman is reminding us, despise riches, give alms to everyone that asks, stand up for the stupid and crazy, devote your labor and your income to others, hate tyrants, and argue not concerning God. Have patience and indulgence toward the people. See, this is the America they told us about in school. Remember those civics classes we took where we were taught this is what America is. It's a country that defends freedom, that extols the virtues of individual human rights and civil rights, that America is a beacon of liberty, in which there really was never supposed to be an aristocratic class and a peasant class, where there was no religious coercion to be one kind of religion or another, and where every person's rights would be respected. I often run into people who act like our progressive views on faith and civics is some kind of brand new idea, like we were running some kind of far-left cult out here, and that we were left to be. I so often hear people referring to people like Bernie Sanders as being crazy. This young woman in New York that surprisingly won a nomination for a Democratic Congress seat, who self-identifies as a Democratic socialist. And people say, oh, if the Democrats start going too far left, they're going to alienate their voters, because all we can really stand is either Republican or almost Republican. But you see this kind of vision of what America was supposed to be that Whitman talked about, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. This is Frederick Douglass, isn't it? This is Sojourner Truth. This is Susan B. Anthony. What we're trying to articulate, what we're protesting for, what we're demonstrating for, what we stand for is not a brand new vision, but folks, we should never underestimate the fact that it is a vision that is currently in danger. It is a view of America that could become extinct. For people who are awake, this week especially has been a bad week. Even before Justice Kennedy announced his retirement, the Supreme Court handed down rulings that further the cause of the wealthy elite who want to break the backs of labor unions. The Koch brothers could hardly keep from crowing about this decision, as they want to drive the wages and benefits of blue-collar workers lower and lower and lower. The Supreme Court literally did a favor for the Koch brothers in this decision. And they voted to affirm the blatantly religious discrimination inherent in Trump's Muslim ban, a decision that anyone, and you know, we know that Supreme Court justices are supposed to rule on what the Constitution says, but you take any 18-year-old that's taken a freshman course in civics, and they could take a look at the Muslim ban and tell you that it was unconstitutional. It obviously is, but the Constitution doesn't say what it says. The Constitution says what the Supreme Court says that it says. And right now, they are interpreting it from such a far-right perspective that it's almost like the Revolutionary War never happened, and that it is their job to reinstitute a monarchy with its classes of lords and commoners, turning America into everything that we despised about Europe. This week we had another mass shooting, and this time it was in a newspaper office in Maryland. Now, this is an example of something that you've heard me say several times. The charged rhetoric that comes almost exclusively from the right, when Trump calls journalists the enemy of the people, when he calls them the lying media, when he points them out at his rallies to his followers and encourages them to boo and shout insults at the press, he calls them disgusting people. It's not that Trump or a member of his administration is going to order the CIA to go out and shoot journalists. It is that through this constant negative rhetoric that they encourage some unhinged follower to go and shoot journalists. I think there's only one country in the world in which more journalists have been killed than have been killed in the United States already this year. We get to a point where people will literally think they are doing the nation a service by killing you for telling the truth. When the President of the United States repeatedly and publicly derides the media and praises the likes of Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, or Xi Jinping, and then inevitably some gun nut will take him seriously and start shooting people. I've lately been reading this book, Tailspin, a book by a Yale journalism professor, Stephen Brill. And Stephen is talking about the 50-year downward spiral that America has been in, abandoning the noble vision that was articulated by Jefferson and Washington and Emerson and Whitman and Paine and Thoreau, that has been threatened by people and politicians who want to make themselves great rather than make America great. And it's an interesting exploitation of how to use capitalism and individual freedom to empower yourself. And Brill likes to use the word building a moat, that they use their money to build a moat around their power that the rest of us can never cross. Now, I'm a news junkie, and it's tempting to me to always focus microscopically on what is happening right now, what's going on this week, what is Mueller waiting for. And we can lose sight of the big picture in which the growing influence of money in politics, all the way back from Supreme Court decisions that allowed money to be untraceable and unlimited in buying politics, that allows us to change the tax laws and the economic rules that continues a transfer of our nation's wealth into the hands of the few. This is a process that didn't start during the Reagan administration. It didn't start during Bush 1 or Bush 2. It certainly isn't Donald Trump. It started a long time ago. Now, I don't know enough about the entertainment industry to know why some movies are released onto DirecTV and Netflix before they ever are in the theaters. But this one in particular, Shock and Awe, boasts a big dollar talent. I don't know how you can get actors and actresses like they have in this movie and it not come out first in the theaters. But this movie came out last year, and it is worth you figuring out how to see it, whatever you've got to do to get to see it. It will eventually show up in theaters, but for now, as of today, you would have to download it through Netflix or something else. I think I got it on DirecTV. It documents the journalistic work of Knight Ridder in the build-up to the war in Iraq. And Knight Ridder is generally recognized as being the only news agency in 2003 and 2004 to accurately call out the Bush administration's false narrative that created their case for going to war. But sadly, Knight Ridder is kind of like the Associated Press. It is a news agency. It is not a newspaper. And so their associated newspapers look at the content that they generate and decide whether they're going to run it or not. And so there were three reporters that were doing fabulous work on exposing the Bush administration's lies about Iraq, but it hardly made it into print. Papers like the New York Times and other thought-leading newspapers basically printed the press releases that came from the White House without fact-checking and without looking into it. And I know that feeling. During 2003, I spent most of my time and energy trying to wake people up to the evident fact that the Bush administration was lying to us. And my efforts didn't accomplish much in 2003 and 2004 other than alienating a lot of formerly supportive church members. But you know, it's being said lately that if preachers are not talking about the separation of families at the border, that they are engaging in religious malpractice. William Barber has been making that point in the last weeks, that if a church is able to stay silent on that topic, isn't that religious malpractice? But as this author is making the point in Tailspin, it's not just right now. The churches were by and large silent in 2003 and 2004 when it was obvious to anyone that cared to think about it that the case for war was not being made. Now, eventually, the New York Times actually apologized to their readers for not running the Knight Ridder stories and for just repeating the propaganda that came out of the Bush administration. I'm still waiting for an apology from National Avenue Christian Church, but as Confucius said, He who waits for roast duck to fly into his mouth waits a very long time. But in case you've forgotten, let me retrace some of these 15-year-old steps. The Bush administration used the al-Qaeda attacks on the United States on 9/11 to manufacture a case for invading Iraq. Now, if you'd even taken my introductory course to world religions, you would know a secular Muslim government doesn't have anything to do with a Muslim fundamentalist group like al-Qaeda. They hated each other. There was no collusion in this case. Unlike most of the time that you hear that word used, there was no contact between the Hussein administration and al-Qaeda. It was a completely spurious claim cooked up for President George W. Bush, largely the creation of Vice President Dick Cheney, with the help of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who doesn't know what he doesn't know, and I could have told him, and the advisor to the president, Condoleezza Rice, as well as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, and it was all sold to the UN by then Secretary of State General Colin Powell. Now, I don't want to be melodramatic about this. I don't want you to hear me as being partisan or derisive, but here are the facts. Facts that I knew in 2003 and facts that virtually everyone has acknowledged for the past decade. These 6 people dismissed reliable intelligence and knowingly inflated what they knew to be entirely false intelligence in order to start a war with a nation that had nothing to do with 9/11 and which had not and could not attack the United States. They didn't have a Navy or an Air Force. They represented no threat to us. And these 6 people lied to the American people to start a war where we still, 15 years later, have troops on the ground. A war that has already cost us over $2 trillion, and with veterans benefits and health care and what have you afterwards will cost another $2 trillion. 36,000 American soldiers have either been killed or seriously wounded. I think the death toll is well over 6,000 and more than 30,000 who've lost limbs or eyes or have head injuries. And if you can let yourself think about it, the Iraqi people who had done nothing to us, we have killed over 1 million men, women, 1 million men, women, and children who did nothing to us. Now, this is, in the most flat-footed, even-handed, rational way of thinking, undeniably a war crime against Iraq. And, may I say, treason against the United States of America. Yet none of these 6 people have been charged with anything so serious as jaywalking. There are nations where they know not to travel because if their plane landed in many Western European countries, they would immediately be arrested and charged with war crimes. But here in the United States, they can smile, they appear on TV talk shows, they write books, they paint while they're sitting in the bathtub. I went to hear Colin Powell speak at MSU a few years ago, and I fully expected that when he was speaking that he would publicly apologize for his role in selling the war on Iraq in the United Nations to the world. And yet Colin Powell stood up in front of college students, professors, and members of the community and almost broke his arm, patting himself on the back for his storied role in American history. I was disgusted by Powell. And even more, it has left me to wonder about how America evolved to the point of having a privileged class, an entitled class, who no matter what evil they do, they are never charged with a crime, and they are never held responsible for their actions. And as soon as he took office, Obama announced that he would not prosecute the war crimes committed under the Bush administration, including torture, because the nation, Obama said, needed to look forward and not backward. Now, folks, I can understand that when Ford pardoned Nixon, he was pardoning him for political dirty tricks. So maybe it was good for the country to not go through a trial that would have inevitably ended up putting a former president of the United States in prison. I understand it. I'm not sure I agree with it even then, but I understand it. But right now we have 2 million Americans in prison. A lot of them are there for smoking pot or shoplifting or burglary. So how can you cook up a plan to steal $2 trillion of American taxpayer money, kill or wound 36,000 American soldiers, and murder 1 million innocent citizens, and then just go out and get six-figure speaking fees? Are we a nation of laws? Or is justice really blind? Or are there people who have to obey the laws or face severe consequences, and another class of people who can do absolutely the most evil things done in the world today and suffer no consequences? Am I crazy? No. I could be a leftist liberal, left to believe that all of us are equally accountable to the law. I don't feel crazy. I might be crazy. I don't feel crazy. I feel like I'm awake. I'm not trying to be strident about this. I think that our judicial system is absolutely out of control. It's way too eager to put people into prisons. Amen. I wish that today I had presidential pardon power, because I would turn 3/4 of the people in our prisons out on parole today. Prison should only be used to protect us from violent criminals. But these 6 people are directly responsible for the deaths of more people than everyone we have in prison added together. They killed more people than every murderer in America combined. And yet they've never been charged with a crime. And for that, everyone in America, unless I'm wrong, everyone in America should be ashamed. Is that too strong? Yeah. I want America to be great, but I want us to be great because we're a free nation, a nation that values liberty, civil rights, and has a justice system that is exactly the same for blacks and whites, for gays and straight people, for the rich and the poor, and for the powerful as well as the rest of us. Amen. Now, to get back to our current situation, 2 years ago, Mitch McConnell stole a Supreme Court appointment from President Barack Obama. I don't think there's any arguing that it was an unconstitutional and unethical political theft. He refused to give Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland a Senate hearing. I think Obama should have fought back. For some reason, it looked like he accepted it. And frankly, I think a lot of the rest of us kind of rolled with it because there was no chance that Clinton was going to lose the election. I mean, there was just no chance that Trump was going to make the next appointment to the Supreme Court. Now, you can, I didn't get real excited at the time because, quite frankly, for me, Merrick Garland was too conservative to serve on the Supreme Court. So you can go ahead and mark that down in your little book as a time when Roger Ray was wrong. There might be other examples. I'm just begging you to not be petty about it. So Trump was able to appoint the 49-year-old conservative darling, Justice Neil Gorsuch, giving at least a 30-year seat to another anti-gay, anti-civil rights, pro-voter suppression, and anti-abortion voice on the nation's highest court. And now Trump is queued up to appoint another nightmare to lock down the right-wing, anti-American nature of the court for another 2 generations. Folks, I may be delusional, and you're going to have to decide for yourselves about that. But I don't see this current battle in the United States as being a conflict between Republicans and Democrats or between conservatives and liberals. In my mind, we are engaged in a battle for a free and democratic America. We are engaged in a struggle between those who want to take reproductive rights away from women, who want to take living salaries and job security away from blue-collar workers, and who want to take voting rights from minorities and the poor, and who have already demonstrated that they are willing to do such heinous things as literally separate babies from their mothers in order to scare immigrants away from coming to this country. We are in a struggle against a vicious insanity and a morally awake America, an America about which we would have good reason to be patriotic. Now, I don't want to be the kind of person who stands up here and wastes your time with a lot of political woe is me, just pounding my chest over how angry I am about illegal wars and aggressive immigration tactics and ham-fisted management of the government without giving you some positive suggestions. I think everyone who complains should also be required to offer an idea. So I have a lot of ideas, but for the sake of time, I'm going to narrow it down to this immediate concern. Senator Mitch McConnell clearly and unconstitutionally prevented Merrick Garland's rightful place on the bench. I am pointing at a picture of Merrick Garland. Not there? Huh. I think that senators who are awake should make it clear that they are not going to vote for anyone that Trump nominates unless he nominates Merrick Garland. He had a fair and just nomination. He was cheated out of it. I think he should be the only one they vote for. We need to stand up for what is right and start insisting that our government do the same. And yes, I know that it probably won't work. I know that because Democrats are in a minority, and I know it won't work, but that doesn't mean you have to cave in right away. I think it should be stated that the seat was stolen and that it belonged to Merrick Garland, and he's the only person that they're willing to interview. Secondly, we should vote this illegitimate regime out of office this fall. We were talking about mantras in class this morning. I've got one for you. Please repeat with me. Go vote. Go vote. Go vote. Go vote. Go vote. You say that to yourself when you're shaving, when you're shampooing your hair. I'm not talking about you, Mark. But we need to change the government. Secondly, I want to say this. Once we've taken control of the House and the Senate, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices. At other times in history, it was 5, it's been 7, it's been 11. I say that when we regain control of the House and the Senate, that we increase the number of justices to 13 or 15. Nothing that says that it can't be done. And if the right wing is going to appoint unfairly and unjustly a strong right-wing constituency, we need to be able to outnumber them with folk that are woke. And we need some real diversity on the court. Right now, we have some women. We have sort of a black guy, although anybody else want to do a DNA test on this guy? I don't know who I am to judge, but he's not very black. And every single member of the Supreme Court for the past generation has either been a Catholic or a Jew. And every single one of them either went to Harvard or to Yale. Now, that's not diversity. That's not reflective of America. Most of America is not Jewish or Catholic, and very few Americans went to Harvard or to Yale. Not to throw shade on those guys, but there are other good universities in the United States. However, I understand the value of appointing younger jurists so that they have a long tenure on the court, and I'd like to duplicate that tactic. I'd just like to see you and raise you one. There is nothing in the Constitution that says that a member of the Supreme Court has to have graduated from Harvard or Yale, or for that matter, law school. You don't have to be a lawyer to serve on the court. So I'd like to nominate some people who might not have the experience on the bench of other jurists, but who have shown the courage that is needed and the fact that they seem to understand ethics. I would like to nominate David Hogg and Emma Gonzalez, survivors survivors of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas school shooting in Florida, because they strike me as being great citizens and exemplary leaders. And there might be reason, if they were on the court, to believe that America would finally get some sensible gun laws. And I don't know their names, but I'd like to find at least 2 of the mothers of these kids who have been taken from their families and made to sleep on the floor of Trump's dog kennel prisons in Texas, because I think they might make good jurors, and they would have a lot more confidence. I would have a lot more confidence in their ability to hand down decisions related to immigration than this Muslim ban-approving posse that is occupying the Supreme Court right now. And just to show that I, too, can be inclusive, I would like to nominate 1 more Catholic and 1 more Jew, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. I know they're comedians, but sadly, over the past 20 years, they have made more sense and shown more insight than any elected official that I know of, Republican or Democrat. I've got an autographed picture of Jon Stewart by my desk where I write these sermons, because it is my life goal to one day be as good a preacher as Jon Stewart is. And I'm not there yet, but I'm working at it. I also don't have a staff of writers. We'll talk about that. And I can say this about them, and I can't say this about any politicians I can think of. I feel like we could trust them. Now, that would make a court of 15 people, and I believe it would be the best Supreme Court that the United States has ever had. It's been a difficult week for people of conscience, but we are a part of a long and storied heritage of progressive people that reach back 200 years, who have had a vision of a nation founded in liberty and justice for all, and always striving for a kind of equality that we in our guts know is right, even if the world has never seen it yet. I refuse to give up on America. We have lost a lot of territory in the last 2 years, but I'm not ready to surrender, and I hope you're not either. Amen.
I see in your eyes the same fear that would take the heart of me. A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship. But it is not this day. An hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men comes crashing down. But it is not this day. This day we fight. By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand, men of the West!
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.